Sending the letters to the senator to support us. So, yeah. Trying to keep busy. You do a good job. Thank you.
Good size. This place is did you get a cookie? Did you get a cookie? Sam, you want a cookie?
We're sitting with the very important people who might know everybody. So you go back away.
Academics. They belong to a swimming tennis club.
Informing a procedure, but if I get it's a terrible.
Yeah.
But if you can bring the stuff
Oh, do you?
The swimming, I don't know about the school.
I think you should, because they're finding almost every day.
Good evening, everybody. Hello. Hi. I'm Davis Farmer. I'm the president of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, and it is my pleasure to welcome everybody here. I see an awful lot of familiar faces. So I'm not going to go through the usual routine about how we're a nonpartisan organization. We don't take political stances. We're supported by our membership and dues and sponsors and that sort of thing. So if you're not a member, please join. And I won't tell everybody what a great deal it is because it bothers Tim that I say those things. But it's great.
Just when you call it cheap.
Oh, it is cheap. It's inexpensive. It's a fantastic bargain, and the return on investment is extremely good. So we're pleased to have you here, and I'd like to hand the microphone to Bill DeVries, who is representing our co-sponsor, the Fulbright Foundation.
Well, and that pretty much says everything I meant to say. I'm Bill DeVries, president of the New Hampshire chapter of the Fulbright Association. The Fulbright Association is an association of mostly alumni, but also friends of the Fulbright program, which, as you know, I'm sure, is the exchange and scholarly exchange, and sometimes bureaucratic exchange program sponsored by the U.S. State Department. It's widespread across the world. We operate in over 100 countries, and like the World Affairs Council, we're dedicated to the idea that understanding among nations is always the surest path to peace. And we think this is one of the most influential and important diplomatic efforts that the U.S. government make. So we just like keeping our hand in and helping support the furtherance of international understanding that the World Affairs Council promotes. And that's it for me.
Well, thank you, Bill, and thank you to the Fulbright Association for their support of this great series. For those of you who maybe have missed the first two in the T. William and Patricia Ayers Global Tipping Point series that we've entitled Making Sense of the World, you can go back and watch a discussion about realism and a discussion about multilateralism, allies, what are they good for. Both of those have been fascinating and a lot of fun. So Gil, you've got quite the act to follow up here, but I'm sure you'll do us well. But my name is Tim Horgan. I'm the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. Thank you to everyone who's joined us here in person tonight, as well as people who are watching the live stream online or who are watching the recording. We really appreciate your interest and your support. As David said, we are a membership, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and so we are here because of you, and we are here through your support. We really appreciate the many ways in which the community supports us as we continue to grow our global community. We are, at our essence, at our core, an organization that wants to center ourselves at the forefront of global conversations. Jaime, you got to get back to me on punching that up a little bit better, but we'll get there. But we are really excited for tonight's conversation. We are so honored to have Gil Barndollar, who is the Senior Research Fellow at the Center for the Study of Statesmanship at Catholic University, as well as a Senior Fellow at Defense Priorities, a think tank down in Washington, D.C. But most importantly, he is a son of New Hampshire and of two wonderful people here, two wonderful supporters of the World Affairs Council. So thank you, Gil, for joining us today, and thank you to Stephen Karin for loaning us your son here tonight. But we're really excited, and Gil, I'll turn it over to you for some opening remarks.
Sure. Thanks, Tim. I've got this on, yeah. Yeah, so our theme tonight, I guess, is an America First foreign policy. Do you want me up there, up here?
Where?
Yeah, right? That's good. Yeah. Yeah, I'm just going to speak for a couple of minutes and try to flesh out what that means and just as importantly or more importantly, what perceptions of that phrase and that idea are. And then Tim and I will discuss flesh out a few points, pull some things out of that, and then open up for Q&A. So first off, I guess the America First Committee, and some of you may be extremely well versed in this, or this may be a very brief history lesson. But the America First Committee was founded in September 1940 at Yale Law School and was, really only in existence for just over a year. I mean, effectively disappeared. Was stood down, dissolved right after Pearl Harbor. And the America First Committee, there's a lot of interesting things in the way what that word means today to the vast majority of Americans. What America First means, especially in a foreign policy context, and what it originally meant when that term first entered kind of the American lexicon, as I said, for barely over a year. So the America First Committee was, and we can go in a ton of different directions on that, and there's a longer conversation about Charles Lindbergh and anti-Semitism and isolationism and other currents. But at its core, if you wanted to distill it, it was first and foremost the largest anti-war movement in American history, and that's probably something we should ground on. And that the overlaps with the current idea of America First are interesting, both where those two things maybe are in concord and where there is a real gap between the initial America First Committee and how that idea is portrayed today. So it was 800,000 strong, a very kind of Midwest-centered movement. As I said, founded at Yale Law School. It was a movement that it drew luminaries from in the American establishment. Some of America's foremost writers were either members or sympathizers with America First. Gore Vidal, a very young pre-enlistment. Kurt Vonnegut was writing in his college paper, Cornell, in support of America First and its ideas. Potter Stewart, Kingman Brewster, Gerald Ford. You had future Sergeant Shriver, future president, future Supreme Court justice. A lot of leading lights of American public life and intellectual life. So when you contrast that with how America First is probably understood today, that's pretty jarring. To go from a generally elite-driven, if pretty mass movement, absolutely a peace movement. We could maybe say a movement for armed neutrality. It was not a pacifist movement as such. But comparing that to what is now an explicitly, loudly anti-elitist, populist and anti-elitist movement, and as we'll flesh out, to some extent, maybe kind of a foreign policy ideology or emerging school. So that's what it was. America First, again, for all the ways it has been rightly, and I think sometimes in some ways slandered, as it was certainly not just some gang of anti-fascists, was not the German-American Bund that was holding neo-Nazi rallies in Madison Square Garden and that kind of thing. It was not that. Although, there are certain overlaps and some, I hate to use the word problematic, but some pieces of that as well. And as I said, it did, when after Pearl Harbor happened on December 7th, America First dissolved within a matter of days, even if some of its members suspected, and not without reason, that Roosevelt was angling to get the United States into World War II. As Churchill told Roosevelt, I think the day of the attack, he said, well, this simplifies things, doesn't it? So, regardless of their personal feelings, AFC stood down, and many, if not most of its members, certainly of age, enlisted and fought in various branches of the United States military in the war to come, the war they had opposed until it began. All right, we'll leave that there and move on. Donald Trump seized on the idea of America First really during his initial campaign for president in 2016. I highly doubt he had any idea of much, if any, of that history. There was not any deep kind of intellectual genesis of this, obviously. And Trump seized on the idea and sort of said at a campaign rally, if he hadn't discussed the idea beforehand, but said, then I'm America First. And that became a tagline both in 2016, throughout his administration, and certainly in the years since he left office in 2021. The idea, in as much as there's coherence to an America First kind of foreign policy school, it would probably be summed up as kind of as realist, as hard-nosed, as pragmatic, and as patriotic, although that's kind of a meaningless word in some contexts. And I would argue realist is probably a meaningless word in a lot of ways too, given how much that everyone wants to take that tagline. Certainly in the last 5-10 years, that word has been abused as well. When Trump's, take one example, when Trump's Secretary of State, when Mike Pompeo is urging inside the administration to recognize Taiwan as a country, and then is telling people loudly that he's a realist, that doesn't accord with almost any conception of kind of a realist or a cautious or pragmatic foreign policy. But setting that aside, so an America First foreign policy would certainly be animated by the idea that the world has changed a lot since September 11th, certainly in the last decade. The idea of the United States has been, from some point in time forward, and to be fair, in as much as there's coherence to a Trumpist foreign policy, the couple of things you can probably hang your hat on are its relationship to border security, to immigration, as both a cultural but also a national security issue, and its relationship to trade. If there's one thing where Trump has been consistent, and there probably are not too many more than sort of tactical deviations, the one through line you could say is the relationship to free trade and protectionism. And I think we can come back to that, but I think that's maybe one lane, one thread that is fairly coherent and fairly consistent. But the idea that America's place in the world as the leader of the tagline, the liberal international order, that is at best a mixed, if not a bad deal for the United States. That the post-Cold War order, after the United States won the Cold War in 1991, the world since has not been kind to the United States, and our purported leadership of what we used to call the free world has not served the U.S. well. And again, a lot of that comes back to trade, comes back to the outsourcing jobs, the United States manufacturing base ebbing, and that's a more complicated picture, but there's certainly some truth to that. And a lot of those decisions, to be fair, and again, Trump and people in his orbit wouldn't necessarily pull this thread all the way. A lot of those decisions go back to the Cold War, and some of those were conscious choices made in the 60s, in the 70s, as part of an American-led order that was facing off against the Soviet Union and against a real competitor, even if at the time, and certainly afterwards, we know that the United States was always much stronger than the USSR throughout the Cold War, certainly in every domain but military, and arguably there too. So, America First as a Trumpist foreign policy school of thought is animated by the idea that the U.S. is being ripped off, the idea that U.S. allies are either cheap riding or completely free riding on American security, especially in Europe, especially in NATO, but in the Pacific as well and other parts of the world. And there's inconsistency and some caveats to that, but this is the way America First would portray itself, I think. And the idea that U.S. foreign policy needs to be driven by a consideration of U.S. national interests and maybe vital national interests above all else, that everything else should be secondary to that, that idealism and American values are at best secondary, if not wholly absent to what the United States should be doing in the world. It tends to be, certainly in practice, if not in expression, and sometimes that too, very transactional. There's some lines from Trump, both in office and out of office, and the latest one getting a lot of run is his line about NATO and about urging Russia to do whatever it wants to NATO scofflaws or members that aren't paying enough, and that 2% number is kind of just is what it is. It doesn't maybe somewhat unhelpful, but certainly there are NATO countries that absolutely free riding the alliance and have been doing so. I mean, this complaint goes back to JFK, so this is not a new thing either. And then I'll move on to kind of the third piece here, which is what is America First in reality, or what are the problems with seeing it as an incoherent kind of school of thought, or let alone school of practice in foreign policy. And of course, I think pretty clearly the problem is Trump himself, in that a lot of the idea of America First as any coherent school is kind of lipstick on a pig, or rationalizations, or kind of grafting, as you could say, with a lot of sort of Trump's agenda domestically as well, is trying to graft an overall ideology or even philosophy into something that is inherently is transactional, is opportunistic, and is not necessarily rational or coherent sometimes. And so I think that's the biggest weakness, or the biggest problem with trying to really label anything as America First, is that it can change at the whims of a mercurial person that calls all the shots and then has built an organization and now essentially a political party that is extremely deferential and that does not have a lot of room for any kind of pushback or other centers of power. You will see some people, sometimes some of the most kind of hard right or kind of Trumpist members, especially in the House and to a lesser extent in the Senate, that might be willing episodically to kind of push back against, that are more Trump than Trump, or would maybe try to portray themselves, maybe even see themselves that way. And that's on some kind of stuff at the margins. You did see a few Republican members of Congress that were much more dovish or sort of skeptical of U.S. support to Saudi Arabia during the Yemen war, and would make that case under realist and kind of grounds. Little things like that, but again, they're sort of on the margins. The problem is when you have a party that, the old description of kind of going broke, that gradually and then suddenly became Donald Trump's party, and certainly in the last, since he left office, but even at the midterms in 2018, you saw this. A lot of the people that would have been any kind of opposition to that, or would have ardently pushed a different school of thought, have kind of seen the writing on the wall and left the Senate, left the House. Governors that have retired versus staying in office or seeking other office, but especially at the federal level. So there's really not, and you see it too. And again, I sometimes think speaking to someone that's sort of in that world, the importance, the weight of a lot of think tanks and sort of non-governmental organizations, think tanks, and places in that kind of world in D.C. I think a lot of them have a lot less influence and a lot less weight than you would think. A lot of them are holding cells for people seeking further employment when their party comes back into office. A lot of what they produce, arguably, maybe is more read than it used to be, because it's gotten shorter and shorter and shorter. Places that used to churn out a lot of books now churn out 100-page reports. Places that used to make their money as 100-page reports now do 30-page reports. Everything has gotten shorter and tighter. Now, arguably, that means it gets read more. But I think sometimes those places, I think, rarely drive the bus in terms of policy. They often hold people who are waiting there to maybe drive the bus sometimes. But in as much as those places matter, you've seen that turn as well. The biggest example would probably be the Heritage Foundation, which was always a very avowedly very Reaganite, very traditional kind of Cold War Republican foreign policy, extremely hawkish, very internationalist, very big on NATO, big on America-specific allies, ready to endorse vast majority of U.S. military interventions, small to big, kind of pretty much dead enders on justifying the Iraq War until it was absolutely untenable. Those places have very quickly, actually, not even so much when Trump was in office, but in a couple of years since, have recast themselves in a Trumpist and America First vein. And you have a bunch of newer sort of Trumpist foreign policy organizations and think tanks that claim to be the true believers. But I guess my point is all those people are now rhetorically swimming in the same sea. The handful of people that were more, that were avowedly kind of Reaganite in their foreign policy views that were at Heritage in particular have left, including their director of defense studies and some of their other kind of heavyweights. So those people have either been shown the door or have seen the door. So again, I think there's certainly an idea of an America First foreign policy. There's certainly a lot of rhetoric behind it. But when you have a principle that is, as I said, Trump is ultimately, and sometimes for better, I do think that the ideology, especially a kind of idealism, you can go back to Graham Greene and plenty of other folks, American idealism can be extremely dangerous and has been in a lot of places in the world, even when sometimes it's a cloak for more realist or pragmatic aims. So I think some of that can be useful, but the fact that there's no coherence to it and there's no staying power. I mean, you can look at a bunch of episodes when Trump was in office, and I guess I'll take a couple quickly and then we'll sort of open it up. But you look at North Korea, where I think people kind of maybe underappreciated. We came semi-close to war with North Korea in middle of Trump's term, beginning of Trump's term. Had he had a different cast of people around him, we very well might have, and that would have been a completely a war of choice. And Trump was sort of driving that with his rhetoric and his with the fact that I think the North Koreans probably struggled to figure out exactly what he was about and what America's posture was, and that very quickly turned in a matter of weeks and months to an embrace of North Korea and a big summit and a photo op, but then no real change to the status on the ground. Trump essentially, as far as anyone can tell, got bored with North Korea, moved on to sort of the next foreign policy adventure, and the relationship with Korea is kind of what it was before. It's an isolated hermit kingdom, occasionally making overtures and occasionally making threats to its southern neighbor, and we're all just trying to kind of manage that problem. You could see, I mean, in the Middle East, it's even more jarring in the sense of we came extremely close again to war with Iran. We went so far as to kill arguably the second most important person in the country, Qasem Soleimani, on Iraqi soil. It came very close to war with Iran. The Iranians did, as they kind of did with Israel, I think, did a sort of symbolic strike that wounded a bunch of Americans, didn't kill anybody, thank God. We might have actually gotten into a shooting war. And then we moved on. Now, the fact that we hit the COVID pandemic a couple months after that may have also tamped down the threat of war in the Middle East. But at the same time, this is an administration that just a couple of months before this had, I think rightly, but had marked a major break with American foreign policy and with the Carter Doctrine by refusing to back up Saudi Arabia when the Iranians directly struck Saudi oil production at Abqaiq and Khurais and took half of Saudi oil production offline, albeit for a matter of days. But that was an incredibly brazen attack on an American. Yes, Saudi Arabia is not a treaty ally, and we're having that discussion right now, but Saudi Arabia has been a long-time American partner for almost 80 years, has been the linchpin of U.S. policy in that region for better and worse, and I think maybe increasingly for worse. But certainly that relationship was viewed as a critical American relationship in the Middle East, and Trump essentially, despite being extremely close to the Saudis and excusing enabling a ton of I would say bad behavior in the years prior, left the Saudis hanging in late 2019. So when you have someone that, and you can pick plenty of examples since, and maybe the TikTok, which is a domestic issue but also a foreign policy issue, certainly being sold as a national security issue, has gone for, it seems pretty clearly for reasons of kind of campaign and campaign finances, it's hard to see this as anything else, has gone from being extremely hawkish on TikTok, on China, on Chinese-owned companies. Certainly people in that world are talking about Chinese-owned farmlands and things are even further down the chain. and now has said, okay, TikTok shouldn't be banned. So if you were, let's say if you were Taiwan, where how you know, your choices in terms of your behavior vis-a-vis this existential threat next to you, you know, your Chinese neighbor 90 miles away, how you react on the one hand, you have Trump's Secretary of State arguing that the United States should recognize you back to the hilt, and you have comments from Trump a couple of years prior saying, you know, this isn't a real thing, we're not gonna, this is 90 miles from China, there's not a military solution here, we're not gonna fight a war over that. So how, that unpredictability and how nations, whether they're in Europe or in the Far East or in between, how they base their behavior off of a very unpredictable, transactional, opportunistic principle, regardless of what this purported foreign policy school around him has to say, I think is going to be the major question if Trump comes back into office, and I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you, Gil. I really appreciate those thoughts and those insights. I think as we get started here on the conversation, we'll start sort of broad and then narrow down. Of course, we'll bring in audience questions. So for those in the room, we have a mic. We'll bring around. But if you're online, you can send us your questions via the YouTube chat or to council@wacnh.org. I'll be checking my phone. I'm not checking the Bruins score or anything like that. So let's start first with the overarching, you know, idea behind America First, which tends to be, as you said, a little bit all over the place. And I've been doing a lot of reading in advance of this meeting, this event, as well as our global forum on May 24th. If you're available, love to have you there. But a lot of what I've seen and read is that the unpredictability is great because no one knows what he's going to do, and so, you know, Putin never would have invaded Ukraine because, you know, he just had no idea what Trump would do, and same with Taiwan, and same with Israel, Gaza, on down the line. So, King, what is your assessment as a foreign policy person about unpredictability in foreign policy? Is it a strategic asset? Obviously, you know, every situation is going to be different, but just in general terms.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the risk of kind of edging and taking easy way out, I think it does depend, and that's sort of a cousin of the kind of madman theory that was, you know, associated with Richard Nixon's time in office as well. That and some of that may have been kind of Kissinger just covering his tail as far as, again, kind of unpredictable and erratic decisions within the White House. But yeah, I think there's certainly a way in which uncertainty can propel American, especially American partners. I think unlimited blank checks to American partners can be dangerous, or certainly can have outcomes we don't want, and we're seeing that in the Middle East right now. I think that uncertainty can push some of our partners, some states that aren't even treaty allies, and Saudi Arabia is a good example. You know, we had I would argue, pretty healthy and helpful warming about Saudi Arabia and the UAE to Iran because they were increasingly uncertain about U.S. support. But you know, that comes with other pieces of the pie, and I think if you're going to say, okay, we want certainly partners who aren't allies, and maybe we want allies as well, to not be too complacent and not think they can outsource their security and even a lot of their foreign policy to the United States. A lot of that is to the good. The flip side of that is that induced unpredictability is going to have consequences. And if we're going to cede influence in parts of the world, I personally have no problem with that. I don't think the United States can or should make the important foreign policy decisions for a huge chunk of the globe. I think that's pretty clearly beyond our abilities, and I don't think the track record of that is great. But if we do that, there are costs. I don't, again, I would argue, you know, the thing you're hearing now a lot, and it's going to, if this supposed U.S., Saudi, Israeli security deal is still viable, it's an open bet whether it is or it isn't, depending on Israeli actions. But that's sort of an example of that. If we walk away from that, or don't make that alliance, that kind of three-way deal, one of the arguments that's going to be deployed in favor of it is that we are ceding influence to China in the Middle East. There's an element of truth to that, but you've also got to look at kind of the underlying dynamics. when 2/3, 70% plus of Saudi oil and Middle Eastern oil in general, and a big chunk of the gas is going to Asian markets and predominantly to China, there's going to be a relationship there. There's going to be a very strong relationship there, and self-interest is going to dictate that, regardless of some things we put on paper and some American weapons deals and American security guarantees. And arguably, it's the worst of both worlds if we're providing security, never mind nuclear assistance and other pieces, to countries that then have an all-important kind of economic tie to our biggest competitor. So I guess, long story short, I think that there's something to be said for not letting a lot of other countries in the world get too comfortable, especially in an era where American resources are not infinite. We've got a growing slate of problems at home. But that being said, there are kind of costs to that.
Sure. We heard a few weeks ago at the second in this wonderful series that the America First idea, putting our priorities first, is not solely a America First approach, that we are always looking to put our interests first, but that perhaps we can do that in an enlightened, self-interested way. Do you see the America First approach as enlightened self-interest, or strictly transactional and strictly, we're going to get the best deal no matter who or what it is we're dealing with?
I mean, I guess a lot of that comes down to the extent to which an America First foreign policy is less interventionist and it's less militarist. And certainly it would be described by its advocates that way. And I think maybe there's an important circularity there with the original America First Committee, in that I don't think the America First idea, or even resurrecting those words as a tagline, would have much resonance, or would have been an electoral plus for Trump, which I think they probably were net, had we not had the foreign policy decisions and I would argue disasters we had in the decade, really 2 decades prior, right? I don't think you get Trump without the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and I would term them both defeats. It's a good book. One of the guys, professor at BU, called The Casualty Gap, looking at that, and they make an argument that when you go by Trump's victories in a lot of rural counties and states that had flipped from being Obama states in 2012 to Trump states in 2016, you can tie that, and correlation, right? But you can correlate that with disproportionate casualties, which are disproportionately rural in America's overseas wars and interventions since September 11th, primarily Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's probably more interesting, actually, in the Republican lane than in the general election. I mean, Trump attacked Hillary Clinton as a warmonger, as someone who had helped certainly start the war, had been for the war in Iraq, had helped push the war in Libya, which is very far down the list for most Americans' attention. But it's another thing that probably doesn't get enough attention. But more importantly, kind of was and I think that was probably a plus for Trump in some of these battleground states. I think you can find, in a really tight election, you can find whichever kind of cause or argument you want for why something flipped by 10,000 or 20,000 votes. But I think that was probably a plus for him. But I think it was even more important within the Republican Party, the kind of arguably the turning point for Trump's campaign, which was not taken seriously by a lot of people originally, right, and was sort of dismissed as this kind of theater or this branding opportunity. The real kind of moment for him was in South Carolina, where he was on a debate stage with whatever it was, 6, 8 other Republican rivals, including some establishment folks that had far more money, far more attention, were seen as the favorites in that race. Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, people like that. Cruz to an extent, although he's a little different on foreign policy. But those guys who were very establishment. Trump attacked the Iraq War, which obviously Bush's brother had started and driven. Attacked the Iraq War, said the U.S. was lied into war, said it didn't make the United States any safer, and was booed on the stage in a deep. I mean, South Carolina is as deep red a state as you're going to find in the country, really. Was booed on the stage, and probably post hoc, some commentators were saying that was a mistake. Trump went on to win that state comfortably. I think he was up by 8 or 10% in South Carolina. Forced Bush out of the race very quickly and was basically cruised through the primaries after that. I think that is a pretty seminal moment in that he said that, and it certainly wasn't a negative. It certainly didn't kill his campaign. If anything, it helped him. So there was the disconnect between Republican voters and their elected representatives. I think that was kind of an extremely telling moment as far as where that disconnect lay. And as I said, the party gradually then, over the ensuing 6-7 years, fell in line behind Trump as they realized how disconnected they were from their voters. You will still find, certainly in the Senate, to a lesser extent in the House, some much more kind of very bellicose, very hawkish, and very interventionist, senators and Republican leaders. But they're an increasingly, that breed is kind of going out of style. Certainly, the younger people who've been elected to office are much more mimic Trump's rhetoric and try to put some coherence behind that. So to kind of long way of coming around to your question, is America First a less interventionist than the kind of conventional, relatively bipartisan foreign policy establishment that it attacks, or not? And I think, I think to some extent it is. I mean, there certainly is a lot. It certainly don't want to spend American blood and treasure in overseas wars. But there are a lot of ways the United States can drive and enable overseas conflicts without being directly involved. Or we can stumble into wars because of the unpredictability and coherence we've already talked about. And as I said, we came reasonably close to two absolute wars of choice against third-rate countries that would have nonetheless been certainly regionally disastrous, almost certainly, and probably would have been horrible for the United States as well.
So talking about the approaches and how this creates ripple effects throughout the domestic politics. If you look, since 2016, the percentages of Republicans who support international affairs and international engagement has plummeted. Democrats have gone in the other direction. But broadly, it's something like 68% of Americans in the most recent Chicago Council on Global Affairs survey supports U.S. engagement of some sort around the world. What has Trump tapped into here, beyond, as you mentioned, the wars, to drive people who traditionally had supported engagement in the world, and what sort of themes and issues are driving this desire to step back and get away from being involved in global affairs?
Yeah, I guess part of what I do, and I don't remember exactly how they worded it. I saw that, and it's a survey they do every year. I don't remember exactly how they word that, but I guess one big question is, to what extent are the words engagement or leadership code word for militarized foreign policy, right? If American leadership is code for, dropping bombs whenever we have kind of the slightest provocation, or American sanction policy, which is another whole kind of can of worms, which I would argue is often extremely counterproductive. I mean, we only have to look off our own shores and look at Cuba and what, better part of a century of sanctions has done there. But there hasn't really been any. I don't know that Trump's foreign policy, America First foreign policy, actually is kind of lessons that way. Certainly, America dropped extremely heavy sanctions, went back to sanctioning Iran. Broke with the JCPOA. There was no lessening of any kind of sanction regime, and some of the very low-cost ways of sort of armed intervention, i.e., drone wars and kind of the tail end of the Global War on Terror. Trump escalated all those, and briefly in this weird, almost a hostage video, kind of escalated in Afghanistan. I think at the behest of his generals, and Obama had done the same thing at a much higher pitch years before. So I guess a lot depends on what you mean by American leadership or American engagement with the world. Again, I would maybe highlight the salience of the trade issue, and I would say that the foreign policy establishment in both parties for really almost the entirety of the Cold War and early post-Cold War era was almost uniformly pro-free trade and saw that as essential to American prosperity, essential to world prosperity, and view that as a win-win, and view U.S. role as driving the Washington Consensus or a global kind of regime of the fewest possible barriers to the movement of capital and labor. I think if that's sort of the term of engagement of the world, I think skepticism about free trade and what that has done to broad-based American prosperity and American middle class, I think that is, I think Trump gave voice to something that before had been not exactly fringe, but it had occupied a very small wing and a declining wing of the leadership of both political parties. You had the Buchananite kind of core in the Republican Party that had been much more skeptical about free trade, but had always been kind of a smaller rump. And you had a rapidly declining number of kind of more populist, more kind of pro-union, Democrats, especially in the Midwest, and again, a lot of those guys in big cap parts of the world had long since left office. So I think Trump, in as much as engagement means unquestioned free trade, I think that's where the biggest disjuncture is.
All right, before we turn it over to the audience, so get your questions ready. You and I, 3 years ago, I think it was, did a podcast, Global in the Granite State. You can find it on our website. Highly recommend. But we talked about sort of the legacy of Trump's foreign policy and what that sort of looked like. Now, 3 years later, we've seen President Biden keep many of the policies in place, whether it's the exit from Afghanistan, the sanctions on China. He has changed some things around trying to get back into the JCPOA, other things, but how much of our foreign policy has been changed by the Trump presidency, and how much daylight is there actually between what President Trump is promoting and what sort of the Democrats are looking at these days?
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways certainly the rhetorical gap is much bigger than the actual policy gap. As you said, the Biden administration left in place, and in some cases accelerated and put far more teeth into a lot of U.S. trade barriers, especially in terms of high tech, in terms of physical hardware and some of those sort of chip war issues, and also kind of intellectual capital and some of these pieces. In a lot of ways, Biden administration increased barriers with China. The tagline they've used is kind of small garden, high fence in terms of how we're going to trade with China. That there's certain small subset of things we're going to fence off, but those are going to be very fenced off, versus kind of more broad-based, kind of blunt, universal tariffs on all Chinese imports, something like that, which Trump, out of office, has spoken about increasing dramatically. How much of that's rhetoric and how much of that he would actually enact is an open question. Certainly there, I think the circularity in the Middle East is also of note. Biden came into office, had made a lot of noise about making Saudi Arabia a pariah state, and the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, who was a U.S. Resident, his murder pretty clearly at the behest of the Saudi state and of the Crown Prince. Biden had and it was a very popular thing to say in a Democratic primary as well 3-4 years ago. Had said we would make Saudi Arabia a pariah state. That very quickly went by the wayside. There was a kind of first a frosty reconciliation, and then a more robust embrace of the Saudi state, and that has continued up to the present. And now we're talking, openly. His top Middle East advisors are trying to push a U.S.-Saudi defense pact, which would be unprecedented, which includes a nuclear technology sharing agreement. Whether that could get through the Senate, either under this administration or under a potential Trump second term, is very much an open question. And whether the Biden team is now saying openly that absent Saudi-Israeli reconciliation, there's not going to be just a bilateral U.S.-Saudi pact. But the continuity is there with a Trump administration that, his first overseas trip period, certainly the first big one was that kind of infamous, putatively kind of counter-terrorist summit in Riyadh and the glowing orb and all that. And further, to be fair, this started under Obama's administration, but further support and enabling and weapon sales to a Saudi coalition that was fighting a losing and now pretty clearly lost war in Yemen, and how we're kind of dealing with downstream consequences of that in terms of Houthi attacks on shipping in the Red Sea and those disruptions in our kind of naval campaign there. I think the biggest gap is really in Europe, and even there, I think it's important to recognize that what we saw from Trump in office, and there's no guarantee it'll be the same way in a second term, but he liked beating the Europeans up to meet this NATO 2% of GDP spending number, and even that number is kind of fake because we're one of the only countries in the world that doesn't include that enormous military health care bill in our defense budget, right? The VA is half the size of the defense budget almost. Most European countries put pensions and military health care in their defense budgets. That 2% is a lot less revealing of what you spend that 2% on. But be that as it may, Trump wanted to beat up the Europeans to spend more on defense. That kind of happened, although Germany is really the underground gorilla on the continent, and there's a lot less than meets the eye there in terms of even post-Ukraine, in terms of German defense pledges. But how would Trump have have handled the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Would it have happened had it been on his watch? I will say that there's some weird. On the one hand, you have a president who openly accepted the conclusions of a, let's say, adversarial foreign leader over his own intelligence services at a summit, which is certainly unprecedented, is bizarre, and I think seems to have this almost admiration for Putin as a strong man, as a national leader, and seems envious in some ways. At the same time, his administration was, in some ways, more hawkish towards Russia than Obama's administration was, in terms of arming the Ukrainians, in terms of giving them javelins, things like that. Obviously that kind of increased defense relationship, despite again the other weird sideline of kind of the Biden stuff and the initial impeachment and the tie into Ukraine there. The fact on the ground, and that may speak to how little control Trump had over his own bureaucracy and some of his own appointees. We had a robust defense relationship with the Ukrainians all throughout that period, continued to train the Ukrainian military. I don't think that we should be taking the lion's share of the credit for the Ukrainians defending their state. I think that comes down to them a lot more than us, but it's certainly all throughout that period, the facts on the ground where we continued to train and arm the Ukrainians, and then of course that increased dramatically once the war started, well into Biden's term. So I think if there is a bigger difference, it's a question of what happens to the U.S. relationship with Europe. There are people around Trump that are extremely hawkish, people that want to be in his administration, some of whom were in the first administration, who are actually genuinely very hawkish about China, would like the United States to be openly, willing to fight a war to preserve Taiwanese independence, and want to shift the vast majority of U.S. attention, U.S. resources to the Pacific away from Europe and let the Europeans deal with their own defense. That is definitely not. The Biden administration is very avowedly and very happily, and maybe even complacently, Atlanticist. So I think if there is a difference, I think that's what would really come out.
Okay, love to turn it over to the audience for any questions. Thank you to the people who have already emailed a few questions in. If you have a question, please raise your hand, wait for the mic, just so that the online audiences can hear us. But while you all think, Janice would like to know why we shouldn't put America first in all of our global relations. So can you talk about whether or not other administrations outside of President Trump have put America first, or if we have not followed our own interests in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, to sort of take the spirit of the question, I think that all U.S. administrations ultimately, I think, are trying to do what they think is best for the United States. I don't think there's a tremendous amount of charity. You only need to look at kind of how parlous the U.S. foreign aid budget is. I mean, in absolute terms, it's huge because we're the biggest economy in the world, but most reckonings. But I think that most of what is done by administrations is done in the belief it's done in U.S. self-interest. Now, I think there's kind of a human desire a lot of time to always seek win-wins and to think that you can do something that's good for you and good for somebody else, and sometimes you're kidding yourself on that. And I think to some extent, Trump and the people in his lane and foreign policy-wise would make that claim that we are pretending to both better help the world and help the United States, and sometimes those things are in opposition. I think that there's also kind of a short and long-term question. I think a lot of the things Trump advocates are probably pretty clearly in the short-term interest of the United States, but what are the long-term consequences of those things? Whether it's sundering alliances without necessarily replacement, vice kind of slowly, patiently, diplomatically hammering them into a shape that better fits American interests and better fits where the world is now versus where it was when those were drawn up. A lot of it is sort of the when and the how versus the purported aims.
Okay. Yeah, Bill, we'll go to you. And introduce yourself so we know who you are.
I'm Bill DeVries again. My question has to do with whether America First as an explicit policy is beset by a certain kind of problem that philosophers are familiar with in moral philosophy. If you adopt as your moral principle self-interest, right? look out for number one. That's the moral principle. Turns out that you shouldn't tell anyone, right? Because if you tell anyone and you spread the gospel, as it were, of self-interest, and everyone starts acting self-interested, and you lose all the benefits of cooperation. So if you're really clever, you'll maybe act self-interestedly, but you'll certainly try to get everyone else to act cooperatively, because that'll be in your interest. Is the America First as a explicit policy beset by precisely that problem, by proclaiming America First out loud? You're going to encourage everyone else to stop cooperating, and you'll lose the benefits of cooperation?
Yeah, I think it's certainly unhelpful in that way. Again, the Biden administration has been more hard-edged, and there are a lot of people that will tell you, leaders in Europe, especially at the beginning of that administration, were put out and were very unhappy with what that administration was doing in terms of trade, and what it was doing in terms of tech restrictions, and what it was doing sometimes very unilaterally. And you saw the AUKUS submarine deal, and we'll see how that's going to play out, because it's going to take a decade plus to come to fruition. But we certainly angered a long-time traditional ally in France by sort of undercutting them and doing that without a lot of overt, open kind of groundwork. And you saw the same thing in a lot of tech restriction stuff with regard to China. Yeah, I mean, I think there's an element of truth to that, especially because I think a lot of sort of multilateralism and kind of sometimes these things are unhelpful in that they're a cloak for self-interest, and everybody can kind of see it, and sometimes that hypocrisy is also unhelpful. It's kind of the inverse of what you talked about. But pretty clearly there are some major world problems that are going to be need multilateral solutions. Climate change is the biggest one. I think that a binary on that is kind of silly, like the idea that you kind of have to give China the farm because you're going to get them to cooperate on climate change. I mean, we arguably did give them the farm trade-wise from the Clinton administration on, and if we passed a point of no return as far as major kind of irreversible climate change, it was because of the massive increase in Chinese coal-fired plants, right? That's what drove things through the roof much more than any other single factor, and that was as a result of permanent most favored nation status. You know, I'm not saying and the alternative is not, hey, we're going to do everything we can to consign 1 billion Chinese people to rural poverty, but I think that there's probably some rough, uncomfortable, for lack of a better word, happy middle, where the United States is going to be generally, as all states do, primarily acting in its own self-interest, but is able to provide some leadership and some organization, some coherence to problems that do need a multilateral kind of global concurrence on. And to be fair, this administration has done that in a couple of ways. Not so much on climate change. That's much more a domestic story. But global minimum tax, things like that. I think that's a small but meaningful step forward. So.
All right, I've got a question. Well, more of a comment here, I guess, but it ties into Bill's question. Barbara is saying we don't need to cooperate. We need to win, and we need to put our interests first. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's all well and good, and there's a spate of new kind of books, and arguably they're kind of job auditions by kind of major Republican foreign policy figures about winning the new Cold War and all the rest of it. Usually books written mostly or entirely about the U.S. relationship with China. That's all well and good, but I mean, I guess my argument would be the United States has already kind of won the lottery just by dint of where we are. I mean, the U.S. in some ways is amazing how much we've squandered, and again, I think that contributed to Trump's rise to office. Given the United States geography is unparalleled. We sit as strategically an island, flanked by 2 weak neighbors, and we have a border security problem, but that's entirely within our power to fix, and it's in a lot of ways is not strictly a security challenge. But we effectively have no meaningful threat to the United States. I mean, this country, if it was just about defending our own territory, could do a lot less. So we've already sort of won the lottery that this is a continental power sitting astride both major oceans with tremendous amount of natural resources. I mean, again, I think people probably know we're the biggest oil producer in the world. We're not energy independent. That's a little more complicated, but we're the biggest oil producer in the world. enormous amounts of natural gas. Even the kind of niche issues to most people that are resource issues. We discover we have enormous new rare earth deposits, a couple of months ago, and those things will probably continue just given where the United States is. And our biggest trading partner is on our southern border, right? So we have these built-in advantages. We have 330 million people, and still, for all of its challenges, the best education system in the world, certainly as far as higher education goes. And people, even during the kind of height of often very overtly xenophobic kind of rhetoric, that people still want to come here in droves, right? So I don't know what the United States needs to do to kind of win beyond preserving its current place. And I think that's a lot easier in some ways if we get out of our own way than a lot of people think.
Yeah. Larry's kind of behind you.
I don't think I do.
Well, for online audiences.
Jack Rich, member of the board of the World Affairs Council. I have the impression, I hope you'll comment on this, that America First is more domestic politics than it is international policy, that it really appeals to the feelings of grievance that people have and anti-elitism, going back to the Iraq War, and that it's going to fade. And one clue to that was when Speaker Johnson said, "I'm going to support aid to Ukraine," he quoted Ronald Reagan, peace through strength. So do you see this America First sort of fading away as domestic politics maybe resolves these conflicts and we would kind of return to a more traditional foreign policy?
Well, before you answer that, I will say, come on May 24th to We Win, They Lose, an attempt to exactly do what you're saying, pair a Reagan foreign policy to a Trump foreign policy.
Yeah.
All right, go.
I would just, I take your point. I think absolutely sort of domestic grievances run through the kind of idea of America First, but I think those things are kind of inextricable, right? I think if you don't have a loss of broad-based prosperity, you can get in a long argument to what extent that was a historical accident that was never going to be maintainable, and that the American middle class was kind of, the mass middle class was a post-war creation, and that was sort of serendipitous. Be that as it may, I think both the real and to some extent the perceived decline of that absolutely contributes to the idea of America First, absolutely makes a lot of casual voters, certainly in 2016, less so in 2020, and we'll see in 2024, interested in what Trump had to say. And anti-elitism, I think anti-elitism is a harder sell, or it doesn't have the same kind of purchase if elites are seen as governing the American interest. And I think that both in terms of U.S. foreign policy, highlighted by two wars, but by no means exclusively that, but at home as well. And if elites were seen as generally looking out for the interests of their countrymen in the main, I think this would have a lot less purchase. I'm not sure that I would be super sanguine that this is going to go away, regardless of a kind of very drawn out, belabored kind of eventual compromise on aid to Ukraine. And aid to Ukraine is such a weird politicized thing. Not that it should be self-evident, and I have major questions about what we're trying to accomplish there and where this war is going to go. But I think that the fact that you kind of eventually got a bill through after months and months of haggling of this, kind of sudden, maybe even religious kind of change on the part of the Speaker of the House, and against a huge chunk of his own caucus. I mean, he survives in office almost, maybe not quite by the numbers, but almost at the sufferance of the opposition party, and that's kind of, if not unprecedented, it's been a long time since that's been the case in the House. So I think the energy, certainly I would say unequivocally among younger conservatives and younger kind of full-time professional Republicans, professional conservatives, all of the energy is with Trump or people in his lane and opposed to the kind of older consensus, both country club internationalist, kind of a more elitist Republican party.
Lee.
Hello, Leah Dearborn, and I guess my question is, in an increasingly globalized and interconnected world, how does an America First agenda pull apart what benefits America first and what is purely domestically beneficial versus what, I'm trying to think how I want to phrase this, versus how you kind of come up with the chicken and the egg. How do you set priorities for an America First agenda?
Well, I guess I would question the idea that it's an increasingly globalized, interconnected world. I think it's an open question, but I think we are going to see, if I was betting between two binaries, I would say we're more likely to have deglobalization, to have more barriers to trade, certainly the movement of people, than we did 20 years ago and than we do right now. I mean, I think if you're going to, you can paint some very dire scenarios and some things that are more gradual, but if you accept climate change on the face of it, you're going to have some major questions about migration. If you look at something, I would tell you that I think Africa is absolutely a tertiary security interest in the United States. But if I was a European, and again, probably a treaty ally of the United States, I would view the political and economic trajectory of Africa would terrify me, because I would think I'm going to have millions and millions of refugees on my door, hitting an aging society and a welfare state that is already kind of running out of runway, and demanding to be let in because their countries are collapsing for a host of reasons. But the heating up of the earth being a big reason. We're again geographically insulated from a lot of that, but there are going to be some of the same pressures on the United States. So in terms of how you set priorities within that, I do think that the other piece we haven't talked about a ton, but just kind of did, the desire to kind of protect the United States, protect its borders, and limit and control entry, I think is going to be a big one. I mean, I think that the build the wall and kind of Trump's border security and immigration impulses, and to some extent fleshed out policy were and are at the core of that idea. So I think that's going to be near the top of the stack.
All right, we are just a little bit past 7 o'clock, but I want to get this final question in because I think it's a really insightful one. But Zach is wondering for any of your insights that you can provide on what we could expect from a second Trump presidency in terms of foreign policy, if you have any key things to think about.
Yeah, and I think a lot depends on who's going to be in that administration. I think definitely there are fewer and fewer neoconservative, let alone the more traditional kind of internationalist, kind of Reaganite Republican foreign policy folks, and the neoconservative folks have all kind of written themselves out of the picture. A lot of them did that. There were a couple of exceptions, but generally most of those folks did that by dint of things they said and did during the 2016 campaign. So the question is whether people around Trump, how sober-minded they're going to be, how where they sit on the spectrum of potential appointees. And I think Trump pretty clearly is someone who is illiterate and doesn't. Presidents read and absorb information in different ways, and I mean, and that's Trump is maybe at an extreme end there, but but FDR was by most lights one of the 3 or 4 greatest American presidents, and basically didn't read dime store novels, and that was about it. And got pretty much the vast majority of information he was getting was from talking to people. Trump is like that to an even further degree. May not have read a book in 60 years for all we know, but so the people that have his ear and the people that control access to him and the conversations he has are going to be the driving thing beyond his own his own kind of preconceived ideas and his own agenda coming in. So it's gonna. I know that's a cliche answer, kind of personnel is policy, but I think that's the biggest thing. And I think the battle, should he win re-election or elections this second term, non-contiguous, the battle among the kind of different schools, folks that are aligned with heritage, with whatever the America First Institute, and some of these other, the Hudson Institute, some of these other places that are holding, or people that are on his campaign, or people that will be plucked out of the ranks of the House and Senate to serve in cabinet posts. Those people who they bring with them, that's what's going to drive this more than anything.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much, Gil, for your thoughts and insights. Thank you to everyone for joining us here tonight, whether you're in person or online watching the recording. We, again, are a community-based organization. We are here for you and because of you, so we need your support, whether that's through membership, through our upcoming annual Gives, or not annual Gives, New Hampshire Gives campaign in June. We will be sending messaging out about that in the coming weeks. But we thank you all for the support, the various ways that you help us to make this work possible. Without audiences, we're talking to ourselves, and that's never as much fun. So thank you so much for coming. We look forward to seeing you at future events, and have a wonderful evening.